Hello, I'm Audrey, and I will be discussing issues in intervention and assessment of ELL students with disabilities. I know the actual term now is EL, but just know that ELL and EL are one and the same in this. So, the main issue in assessment of ELL students is that there is either misidentification, as in under-identified amount of students or an over-identified amount of students. And so we can look at the statistics from 2015 to get an accurate picture of it. So 9.5% of all students in public school were ELL, and then 14.7% of that population had disabilities. And then the most common disabilities are, of course, going to be speech and language impairment and the specific learning disabilities. And that is true for the other greater population of disabilities. So we can look here at the 2015 data for students with disabilities and the ELL population, and that percentage is higher than the national percentage of everyone with disabilities, which is 13%. So there seems to be an overrepresentation of students with disabilities in the ELL population, and that could mean teachers are going ahead with referrals without giving them time to learn the language or things like that. So let's move to the next slide. There was a national assessment project that studied the over-identification, and they found that, again, the overrepresentation of students with disabilities who are ELL was extreme in this one, 68% versus the 22% without. And so it seems to be an over-referral. But then, you have to look at the other side where in some places there's under-referral, and that can be because the teachers and everybody is waiting for them to acclimate to the school and get familiar with the language, and then they find out later that they're still not making gains in that, and so then the referral process is delayed by, years even. When we look at standardized assessment of ELL students with disabilities, we first think of the English proficiency exams that they take annually and also initially when they enter into the school. And that kind of shows teachers where they are and where they need placement for, getting the supports that they need in English proficiency. But then we also have to think of the normed assessments that we give to everybody and how ELL students perform, and also then how ELL students with disabilities perform. And I really liked the quote there that it was pretty consistent in all the literature I was reading too, that because already students with disabilities are lower achieving on these exams, that they will be, twice as underachieving if they have a language barrier to go on with that. So just really being aware of that, and that these results we see are going to be pretty awful, and that's not really who the student we know and see every day achieving. So they have a lot of ground to gain to get their results even close to what those with ELL kids are like and what kids with just regular disabilities and no ELL problems have. And that is, pretty dramatic. Now, moving into classroom, the monitoring and assessment for these students and what it could look like. We have the incremental rehearsal study, and that showed just 2 participants is really limited for sure. And they had shown modest literacy gains after using the technique, which was really favorable because it does have repetition and errorless learning and all of those things. But there was a student in the study, the first grader, who needed to be referred for special education because they found that during the sessions where they were teaching, he was not making the gains, whereas the other student, while he was struggling as well, he was kind of forgetting the material and then going back and being able to learn it quickly when he was in the session. So that's how they kind of differentiated which learner was needing more supports and was actually showing signs of disability, whereas the other one just needed more practice. And once the researchers upped the interventions with him, he made the gains that they thought they would see from the start. And so this was a little bit of a reliability issue because they had multiple researchers taking data and it didn't quite all match up, which would be kind of hard for a um, letter and sound intervention study. I think that's a little bit more difficult when you're trying to discern whether the student has said the letter sound correctly, perfectly, etc. So really the biggest takeaway from this was just that these researchers wish they had had more background information on students like this and where the gaps were when they came in with their language and how capable they were with their primary language and where they need to go. Um, the RTI model, the response to intervention model, is pretty useful for these ELL students because we can monitor them from the start by seeing where their language is upon entry, and then therefore we can compare later what the English language abilities are, and so that way it's a complete history of their language acquisition in English, and we can kind of see what's effective, what's working for them, and just that there's less disadvantages in trying to access the materials. And so the use of accommodations for disabilities is really important because already the language barrier is going to be there. So I think knowing what accommodations they need is so important, but it is completely another topic to elaborate on that I couldn't do here. So in summary, what can we do as teachers and what can school psychologists and speech language pathologists do? And so we've talked a little about the response to intervention model, and that could really prevent those misidentification problems where, too many kids are being referred or those ones that slip through the cracks or not. And so if only that was a standardized model, then, we wouldn't see that wide variety across state to state. And then, don't just use those assessments like the English proficiency exam or that one cognitive abilities test to determine these things because clearly they're not going to give you an accurate picture of that student. So you've got to have multiple routes of knowing the monitoring and also the identification of the student. And then there are standardized language assessments that speech language pathologists had reported were the most used predictor for disabilities with these students. So there are some assessments that can really pinpoint that if you're really on the fence with it. And it seems to come from the speech and language types of assessments, which makes sense, right? And just to reiterate that if we can assess them early in their primary language and then from there do bilingual assessments and monitor their English assessments as well, then you kind of see a picture of the movement towards English proficiency that way. And just think of the other ways that we can assess students in a better way, such as using universal design for learning types of assessments, because they can take a kid who may not have all those accommodations on an IEP yet, but still be able to complete the assessment with a lot of supports. And then the Oklahoma English language proficiency exam is universally designed, I believe, and helps a lot with students who have just moved in and may not have as much capability on the computer yet, or they're really young students. And this can be a great equalizer for everyone. So use other things too. Use your observations, use those checklists, and interview parents and anybody involved in their life, and you'll get a much better picture of this type of student. And really, just they need those supports, and we need to get them capable of achieving on the levels that we see with other types of populations. And that's probably the hardest thing because it is such a big gap. But that's the more we know, the better we can do in the future. And here's the references. I hope you appreciated this, and it probably gives a little bit better overview than my paper does. So have a good night. Thank you.